storm kind of like dissipated. But a storm ended up going to another location and tore up the place. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. If you use your consciousness to try to change something, it could actually create something way worse than what you're trying to fix. Or if you're, trying to get into somebody's, brain, or you're trying to remote view. I mean, I've had a remote viewer on my show, and the problem is they said that their average was about 75% right, not 100% right. So there's a chance of, if not being accurate. But again, too, by remote viewing something, he did say that one time when he was in the government remote viewing, that he was remote viewing something, and all of a sudden he locked into his counterpart in another country that was actually remote viewing what they were doing.
Yeah, it's a whole new world that it opens up.
Oh, yeah. He said that was kind of really crazy, because here he is trying to remote view another spy agency, and all of a sudden they were like remote viewing our agency, and he said it was rather interesting.
It's unbelievable. But like you say, there are these people that have way above average abilities, and it might not be 100%, but the fact that these things are real, just want to emphasize, I mean, that is it implies the need for a massive paradigm shift in our science and also our thinking about everyday life. This is huge.
Well, it does, because, look, going into the paranormal, I know your book is not what you mentioned, paranormal, but again, psychics and all this stuff, that communicate with the dead, or, entities or stuff like that. I mean, I some of them I've had on my show, I don't believe a word they said, to be honest with you. But I've had some other ones on here that what they said, I mean, I checked them out, and it was really scary. They were dead on. And that makes me think that some people do have that gift to, to remote view or to communicate with the dead. I mean, it tells me that there is so much more that we don't understand. It does.
Well, I was shocked to know that mediumship is actually something that is being studied, and I wish there was more funding for these types of studies. But at the Windbridge Research Center, they have run 2 studies that have made it into peer-reviewed journals in Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing, where they tested mediums under controlled conditions, 5 levels of blinding, where the medium is on the phone with an experimenter, and the experimenter just gives the first name of the deceased person. So the medium doesn't even know whose relative this is. And later the answers are scored because the experimenter asks some specific questions. And what they found in these studies is that the mediums are able to get information beyond what chance would predict under 5 levels of blinding.
That is interesting. Hey, I got to interject something here. Karen, one of our listeners, has sent me on chat. She goes, I remote view in sleep and can't tell the difference. Really creepy when they come true or see them on the news a few days later. It used to scare the hell out of me and my mom. So basically, she would have, in her sleep at night, she would kind of remote view, something that was going to be in the future or something.
Yes, I'm glad she mentioned that. Thank you for that comment. The way I think about consciousness to fit this data is not only is consciousness primary to anything physical, but it also exists beyond space and time. And therefore, consciousness can access things that seem to be at a distance, like remote viewing, but also at a distance in terms of time. And we see that with remote viewing very often. I should reference Dr. Jessica Utz, who in 2016 was the president of the American Statistics Association. In 1995, Congress and the CIA asked her to look at the evidence for psychic phenomena and say, look, Dr. Utz, is there anything here statistically? And what she says in her publicly available report is that using the standards applied to any other area of science, psychic functioning has been well established. So she acknowledges that these things are real statistically, but to your listener's question about time, she also talks about precognition, which is knowing the future before the future is ostensibly known by anybody. And she also says that effect seems to be real, in addition to many other studies that I referenced. So it is something that seems to come up, that our consciousness is not tied to the here and now, and that in some cases is able to almost reach forward to see or feel a very probable future.
Well, have you ever had that happen to you personally, Mark? Because I know it happened to me years ago. I had a dream, and it was so realistic that me and my wife were going to go in this place of business, and, as a certain scenario was going to play out. And I go, okay, that is a real weird dream. About a week later, we go into a business, right? All of a sudden, the guy was in my dream. I swear to God, he was behind the counter. And everything almost to the T played out what was in my dream. So, I mean, did I remote view something in the future or what? Have you ever had that happen to you personally?
I've had more subtle examples, and they've happened more and more as I've gotten into the research. I don't know if that's a form of confirmation bias or if I'm literally opening up to things more, but it's something where I'll dream about a person, and then that person comes into my life that day or the next day, and it's not someone that I ever normally think about. There are cases, one that I reference in the book, in January of 2018, a Virginia resident dreamed the lottery numbers. And he purchased identical tickets with those numbers and ended up winning $400,000. So there are some cases like this that I hear about, and where they're in extreme detail, and then the event actually happens. We can explain this by viewing consciousness as being beyond space and time, and something about the dream state allows us almost to access or tune into a different radio station. If we think of the brain as like an antenna, maybe something about the dream state allows us to get there.
I don't know. I've had a scientist on my show recently. It says that we go into a parallel, world, another parallel, plane. And that's, how we remote view. Yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting, when you really think about all these things. And, it makes you, again, think there's so much more to life than just going to work and coming home. And then that's it. It also makes you wonder, like, if you die, maybe it's not just that's the end of it. Yeah.
Well, I think the mediumship studies certainly raise questions about that. There's a phenomenon of near-death experiences, which I talk about at length in the book, and it gets to your question about, is there more to life, and is there meaning, and is there potential survival beyond the body? I think that research is extremely compelling, because in those cases, there are people that have, for example, they're in cardiac arrest, meaning their heart has stopped and there's no blood flowing to the brain after a certain amount of time. And in studies that have been done by a cardiologist, Dr. Pim Van Lommel, for example, he published a study in the Lancet Journal, which is one of the most prominent medical journals, where he looked at cases of people who have cardiac arrest, and 18% of them reported a vivid near-death experience during this time when they shouldn't have any memories. If their brain is off or is highly impaired with no measurable functioning, how should they have a lucid experience where they're hovering over their body? Sometimes they see things in the room that are later shown to be accurate from a different vantage point. They sometimes report a life review, and this gets to your point about, does life mean anything, where people talk about kind of experiencing their whole life in a flash. And again, this is when their brain is off. And they're judging themselves for how they acted towards people, number one. It's never about the material things that they achieved. What they come back talking about is they're judging themselves for the way they treated people. And in some cases, they actually relive those events through the eyes of people that they affected during their life. So let's say Bob is in cardiac arrest. He's having his life review with no brain functioning in some kind of other form of consciousness, and he recalls an event when he was really mean to a woman named Jane, and he might relive that event as if he were Jane, through her eyes, feeling the emotions that he inflicted upon her.
Oh,
and then
yeah.
He comes back into his body, and many people are forever changed because they realize that life is not about what they thought it was about.
Well, I was just reading a study here too, Mark. It was interesting. I always thought when you died, that was pretty much it. But again, I was reading a study. They said sometimes up to 5 to 7 minutes after you've been pronounced dead, your brain is still processing information. And the person who wrote the article was saying that, that could be almost a living hell, because here you are, you're dead, right? They put a sheet over your head and you're still trying to comprehend, am I dead? Or am I alive? And you're trying to process all this information. Then all of a sudden your whole life flashes, like you mentioned, like review, it could be going on. But then I started thinking really eerie things, like decapitation, where they used to, France, where they used to decapitate people, or, or in the UK, where they used to chop people's heads off and the head would roll. And if the brain was still processing information for, a few minutes, that would be so scary. But then, I had a guest on my show here 6 months ago. She died in the operating room on the table, and they pronounced her dead. And all of a sudden, she saw herself, looking down at her body, listening to what the doctor's saying. She even heard the song that they were playing on their little music box. And all of a sudden, they revived her, or she came back. And, she told the doctors, I heard what you said, and and then they kind of didn't believe her. And they said, okay, well, you were playing such and such song on your, cassette recorder, and all this stuff. And, there's cases like that. So, I do think that, again, there is something more out there we just don't know. And I don't want to find out when I pass on. I want to know before I do, honestly.
Well, it's a good thing that more and more researchers are starting to look at this. I mentioned Dr. Pim Van Lommel. Also, Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Virginia has studied this extensively. And what the researchers who really get into it have concluded in general is that there seems to be a lucid conscious awareness when the brain is not functional or has minimal functioning. So it's almost as if consciousness, or not almost, it's as if consciousness is acting independently of a functioning body. And that would explain things like they're called veridical out-of-body experiences, when the person's out of their body and what they report is accurate, it's verified, veridical. Those can be explained if the consciousness itself is not tied to the physical body. And something about this near-death experience is kind of releasing the consciousness, and yet it continues, but it's just not in the body.
Wow. Now, hey, our time is almost up. Now, do you have a website you can give the information to our listeners, Facebook page, media? Do you have any information you want to get out here in the last 3 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. My website is a good place to start, which is just my name, Mark Gober, MarkGober.com. And it has more information on my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, which is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, many bookstores. But my website also has a media page, which has the various interviews I've done recently. So there are many of them on there, different podcasts and radio shows and some TV shows that I've done recently. Also some articles I've written. So if your listeners are interested in learning more beyond the book, that's a place to start, and it's all free.
Oh, wow. Now, do you plan to write any more books about this subject? How is this writing this a book? How has it affected your life, your everyday life?
People are asking me all the time now if I plan to write another one. At this point, I don't have any specific plans, but I could, now that I've done one, I could see it happening in the future. In terms of how it's affected me, I would say massively has affected me. One has to do with this idea of meaning that, number one, maybe our consciousness isn't tied to our body, and therefore it's not the end when the body dies. And wait a second, that might mean that there is some accountability to what happens during life. That is a new perspective relative to what I thought before, where I thought life was over when your body dies and there's no meaning. It seems as though there is meaning, and it has to do with how we treat one another. And that is a theme that comes up over and over again in the research that I've done, which all points toward the idea that not only is consciousness the basis of reality, and the brain is just a processor of it, but that we are fundamentally connected as part of the same consciousness, just having kind of individuated experiences. So, for example, Erwin Schrödinger, the famous physicist, and I talk about quantum physics because it points here too, he said, in truth, there is only one mind. And that's kind of where I come out to as a way of explaining these things. That has massive implications for how we think about treating one another, and it gets to issues like not only personal relationships, but things like world peace and whether we can coexist on this planet. If we